8.2 is where you're going to be multiplying polynomials and finding the greatest common factor. So the first one that you see is you're going to have a monomial, which means one term, times a binomial, which means two terms. So just like we would before, we would go ahead and distribute this 12x to both terms. So 12x times 12x would be 144x squared, and 12x times 11 would be 132x. Now remember, I am adding these two exponents right here when I times my monomial, so that's why it changed to an x squared. Notice the second one, you would still be distributing, but notice the piece that you distribute is on the back side. So why don't you pause the video and see if you can do this one on your own. Okay, let's see if you have it correct. So after I distribute, it does not matter if you distribute to the 7 first or the 2x first. You still just need to multiply to both of them. So my answer should say 16x squared plus 56x. Now, if you times these first, then you'd have the 56x first. So you would need to rewrite it so that it's always in standard form. So the highest exponent comes first and then decreases. Okay, now let's look at the next set. So the next set is progressing a little bit because you still have one term on the outside edge, but now you've got more terms on the inside, more than just two. You're still going to do the same thing. I'm going to take this outside term and just distribute all the way across until I finish to the end of my parenthesis. Now remember, we are adding exponents when we do this. So when I times 11x squared and negative 5x cubed, I would get negative 55x to the fifth. When I times 11x squared and 8x squared, I would get 88x to the fourth. When I times 11x squared and 9x, I would get 99x cubed. And then when I times 11x squared and 8, excuse me, I would get 88x squared. I could not combine any of those because none of those have like exponents. Pause the video and see if you can do the second one. So I would distribute on the second one, and my final answer should say 27x to the fifth minus 81x to the fourth minus 99x cubed. Again, times your coefficients, add those exponents. Okay, now we're going to switch gears. Now we're going to find the greatest common factor. So back in middle school, you practiced finding the greatest common factors of whole numbers. Well, now you're going to find greatest common factors of terms. So what you're going to do is, if this is my polynomial, 5x cubed plus 25x squared plus 45x, you're going to first find the greatest common factor of the numbers. So I wrote down all my coefficients, 5, 25, and 45. Then I listed their factors. So factors means what are all the numbers that would multiply to give you that. So for example, all the numbers that multiply to 5 would be 1 and 5. All the numbers that multiply to 25 would be 1, 25, 5 times 5. All the numbers that multiply to 45, 1 and 45, 3 and 15, 5 and 9. So those are all of my factors. Then hence the name greatest common factor, I have to find the number that they have in common that is the biggest. So the biggest number they have in common is 5. So I just took care of all of the numbers. Now I need to go back and do all of the variables. So my three variables are x cubed, x squared, and x. So I'm just writing out what that means. If I have an x cubed, that really means I have 3 x's. If I have an x squared, that means I have 2 x's. If I have an x to the first, that means I have 1 x. Greatest common factor is the highest amount that they have in common. So I have one set that they have in common, so that means I would write it down as x to the first. So my greatest common factor would be 5x. So you're going to do the same thing. So pause the video and see if you can do the got it question. Okay, so you needed to list all of your numbers, so positive 3, 9, and 12, and then I would list out my factors. So I would get 1 and 3 for 3, 1, 3, and 9 for 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 12 for 12. So all the numbers that multiply. Then I would come back and find the highest number they have in common, which would be 3. I would do the same thing for my variables. So after I listed all my variables, x to the fourth is 4x's, x squared is 2x's, and x to the first is 1. They would have only one x that all three of them share. So my greatest common factor would be 3x. Okay, so the next thing is, since we've practiced finding the greatest common factor, now we're actually going to put it to use and factor it out. Okay, so it wants me to factor this polynomial. So what that means is you are going to first find the GCF. Okay, so the process we just did in problem 2, you're going to do it in problem 3. So I would list my numbers, list my x's, and find my greatest common factor. So I did that. So I listed all my numbers. My GCF of the numbers would be 4. Listed all of my x's. The most they have in common is 1. So I know my greatest common factor is 4x. What you're going to do is we're going to factor it, which means you're going to pull it outside of our set of parentheses and write what's left over on the inside of the set of parentheses. So what that looks like is this. I put the greatest common factor always right here, and then I write what's left over on the inside of the parentheses. Now when I say left over, that means you have taken each of these terms and divided by 4x. So here goes our exponent rules from last chapter. So when I divide 4x to the 5th, 4 divided by 4 is 1. X to the 5th divided by x to the 1st means I subtract it, so I get x to the 4th. Negative 24x cubed divided by 4x would be negative 6x squared. 8x divided by 4x would just be positive 2 because the x's would cancel. This is my final answer. So again, you're doing the greatest common factor and then writing what's left over after you divide all of those terms by the greatest common factor. So if you will, you're doing the reverse of what we did up here. We multiplied up here. Now you're trying to find what that form is given this answer. Alright, pause the video and see if you can do the got it question. Alright, in the got it question, you should have found that 3x squared was your greatest common factor. Now this one's a little bit different because you had two sets of x's, so make sure you write that as an x squared that they had in common. Alright, so now for my answer, I put the 3x squared out in front, and then I divide each term by 3x squared and write what's left over. So when I divide, I would get 3x to the 4th plus 5x squared plus positive 4. If you have any questions, let me or Mr. Gahan know. Otherwise, go ahead and start on your assignment.